I'm a 27-year-old male who has spent a lot of time outdoors. And inevitably, I have found myself in a couple of sketchy situations, usually whether wildlife or injury related. On one particular occasion, I had to scale a steep hillside in the rain that was entirely slate to get the attention of rescuers for a medically stranded friend. This summer's camping trip was definitely something else. I was doing a 2.5-day solo trip through the Olympic National Rainforest in Washington state. I had my typical kit for this kind of trip. In addition to the basic camping equipment, I carried a couple MRIs, and some fresh fruit bear mace map and compass flares, and a basic first aid kits. Of course, I also brought my Smith & Wesson MMP I've learned from past experience to be overly prepared. I knew it was probably going to rain at some point, but hoped for an overall easygoing trip. Unfortunately, there would be nothing easy about it. The first day went according to plan, but it was grueling. It was hot and humid, and I went through more of my water than I anticipated. I kept myself on pace by whistling and singing to myself as I walked. That night, I did the usual setting up of camp, getting a small fire going and eating dinner. I was beat and was practically falling asleep sitting up when I heard something that made my eyes snap wide open. The distinct whooshing sound of something rubbing up against my nylon tent. Normally, I would chalk it up to the wind. But that night was completely still. I realized this at the time, and then I looked up and noticed that the bugs and frogs had all gone completely silent. It may sound silly or cliché to those who haven't experienced it. But total silence in the forest at night means trouble. I chambered around and made my way over to investigate what was rubbing up on my tent. As soon as I started moving, the sound stopped. As I approached, I did not see anything obvious. But in the dim moonlight, a soft figure several feet away. Now at first glance, it didn't look like much. But the longer I stared, the more it looked like a person hunched over. It appeared to have long skinny arms and legs and looked to be hiding his head in his hands. Almost like it was trying to hide his face. Went into my tent to grab my flashlight. But by the time I showed it in the direction of that creature, it was nowhere to be seen. I was a little unnerved to say the least. I had my pistol close at hand that night, and despite my best efforts to fall asleep, I couldn't help but notice that there was no sound of wildlife the entire night. If this wasn't a deafening silence, I don't know what was. The next day was miserable. Nothing but rain, which made the already rocky trail even more treacherous, forcing me to move slowly. The whole day. I didn't see any wildlife, but I felt eyes on me. I would hear a light scampering behind me like something was following me. Or when I turned around there would be nothing there but the trail behind me in the thick brush. Eventually, the rain became so heavy in the leaves above me in the hood of my raincoat, but I could not hear anything. This only added to my anxiety. It became so heavy at one point that I stopped in a small cave to wet it out. I was exhausted, soaking wet with rain gear, and in pain from taking more than a few spills on the slippery trail. I in that Marie and took check of what gear it was wet and what was dry. I continue whistling to myself just to keep my spirits up. The rain didn't stop until it was dark. If I didn't even bother setting up my tensing as everything was wet, and once again, I was too tired to keep my eyes open. And at some point in the night, I was jolted awake once again, clear as day. I heard someone whistling in the distance. It was one of the same tunes I'd whistled throughout the last 2 days. I poked my head of the cave, just to see if another hiker was out late at night. It was raining again, not nearly as hard as earlier, but between the rain and it being 3 a.m. It didn't make sense for any other people to be out and about getting a bad feeling. I decided to start packing up my gear. As I started getting out of the cave, I saw movement just outside. I showed my life for just a fraction of a second. I saw a hand wrapping around the edge of the cave entrance. It was gnarly looking. Gray, skeletal, and the fingernails were dirty and more like claws. But it was clearly a human hand. As soon as the light hit, the hand drew back. Someone was clearly watching me and did not want to be seen. I held up my pistol and called out. I'm honored to announce yourself. What happened next was one of the creepiest experiences I've ever had. There were a few seconds of silence that I heard someone just outside the cave, whistling my tune, echoed off the cave walls and was deafening. I didn't waste a second. I fired off 3 rounds into the forest, just as a precaution, and looked it out of the cave. I was fortunately right by the trail, and I started sprinting back to where I knew, or at least hoped, my car should be waiting. The whole time I ran at her whistling coming from every direction and the footsteps rushing alongside me. Soon, I became too exhausted to keep running and eventually had to start moving tactically, pistol down, rushing to spots I could potentially hide and crouching to catch my breath. During this time, the whistling continued. At one point, I was so exhausted, I almost gave up. I thought I could just sit down just for a moment. I really just wanted to sit down for a minute. I'm not sure exactly what it was. But something my head told me that this was not an acceptable option. I had to keep moving. And so I did something I swore to myself I'd never do. I abandoned my gear on the trail and booked it. After a few minutes of running, I exited the forest, and as soon as I was out, the whistling stopped. I didn't stop running though. I eventually found my car and sped all the way home. A couple of days later, my brother accompanied back to see if the rangers had found the gear I left behind. The first ranger at first tried to nail me for littering in the park. When I told him I was being chased by some unseen whistler, he of course did not believe me. Another ranger who appeared to be Native American overheard our argument and convinced the first ranger to leave me alone. The second ranger gave me a very stern look and said, "Don't ever whistle in these woods. There are things out here that take that as a dinner invitation." He told me that they will keep a sharp eye out for my belongings, but not speak any more on what have probably been chasing me. After doing some research, I believe I was being stalked by stick people. Regardless, since then, I don't whistle while I walk through any patch of woods anymore. I used to be a county park ranger in Humboldt County, California, before working in maintenance at Del Norte Redwood State Park, after which I then lived in Jed Smith State Park for 3 years due to my husband working and maintenance there. Years later, I went on to become a co-state park ranger in North Washington, Colorado, and Tennessee. Prior to my ranger days, I worked for the Conchi Air and Yosemite in Grand Teton National Park, where I also had terrifying moments. Truthfully, it's a wonder I'm still alive, literally. Needless to say, I have some truly terrifying stories. The final one that ended my career after working in Tennessee was definitely the worst. For now. However, I will start with the oldest one. In 1981, I was working at Universal Studios in Universal City, California. I had heard MCA, which was Universal, also owned by the cashier and Yosemite National Park, and because of my love of nature asked and was granted to be transferred. Unbelievably, right before I arrived in Yosemite, an FBI agent had been murdered in the past arc and seen floating down the Merced River that runs through the park. Upon my arrival, I was assigned to share a dorm with a girl named Jennifer Thomas. And at this time, I was totally straight. I did not do drugs. I was an athlete in high school and had zero desire for drugs or anything like that, yet walked into the middle of this huge crime ring in this beautiful park. Cocaine and every other imaginable drug was available for all the rich and famous who came to stay at the Ottawa Barney Hotel, with drugs, crime and murder, and hence why the FBI was called, since it was federal land. Apparently, there was a number of undercover agents whom, of course, no one knew who they were. They were in grave danger, demonstrated by what happened to the first FBI agent found floating down the river. Not long after my arrival, my roommate Jennifer brought out a small mirror covered in white powder and asked me if I wanted to take some. I was so shocked and said no thanks and left it at that. A few days later, she confronted me. She stated that she thought I was an undercover agent, which of course I adamantly denied. I knew instantly I was in grave danger, especially because the suspected head of the drug ring was no less than her brother, who also lived in the park. I called my aunt, who was a defense attorney at the time, and told her what was happening. She stated if I left federal property, they would most likely kill me for sure, and thought I had better off staying in the park. I found my friend, a national park ranger named Carrie Maxwell, and told him that I was being accused of these things. He too was in fear for my life and confronted Jennifer and told her I was truly an innocent bystander and had nothing to do with being a cop. And from that day on, he picked me up in his ranger car and drove me 1,000 feet to go to work and back every day. Finally, I had enough and ran from the park, looking over my back for quite some time. So much for a peaceful, beautiful park experience. I had thought I had also been chased by a big black bear while walking outside that chased me into the reservation office. He only stopped running once he hit the front door and was confronted by a number of people standing there who began yelling at him. That was my first terrifying experience in nature. I'm a law enforcement ranger in northern Wisconsin. And my experience in the Copper Falls State Park has been interesting. I've seen everything from drinking people running naked through the woods, the teens smoking the occasional joint in the parking lot. Anyway, one night after the park closed for the day, I drove my squad to different locations in the park to make sure no one was around as I came upon a vehicle parked on the side of the trail. I turned my emergency lights on to let the occupied vehicle know that I was there before letting dispatch know what I was doing. Soon after, I put the radio down and looked at the vehicle. I noticed the movements inside didn't look natural and the windows were tinted a little. It was when I hit the spotlight and takedown lights that I saw it. This thing in the vehicle was looking directly at me. It was slim and pale, and I almost thought it was albino. Its eyes were glowing sort of greenish yellow and unsettled me. I radio dispatched to send a state trooper my way. After this, I got into my squat car and immediately unholstered my sidearm and pointed it at the creature. It looked at me, making a loud clicking sound with his mouth wide open. In its mouth, I could see tiny, sharp teeth. Suddenly my radio went off. It was dispatch telling me my backup should be pulling up soon. I acknowledged them, saying 10-4. As I looked back at the creature, this thing looked as if it was distressing. Almost like someone had locked it in their vehicle. I had no idea what it was, but I was not going to let it out. Just as I was reaching the driver's side door, the state trooper pulled in, parking next to me. The trooper, let's call the state trooper Mark, asked me what was going on. I pointed out the vehicle and his face with hail. Immediately, he pulled his sidearm from his holster and said, "What the heck is that?" I said I didn't know and asked him what we should do about this thing. Mark replied, I don't know, with fear in his eyes. I told him I was gonna let it out and reach for the handle of the driver's side door. I also informed Mark, if it comes my way, light it up. He nodded and grabbed the handle, this time opening the door. I immediately backed up so fast, I didn't have time to grab my gun. After that, we waited for the creature to flee. But it just stood there in a vehicle looking at me and Mark, clicking and making scratching sets the window, and then moved its head over by the driver's side where I opened the door. Mark asked me if he should shoot it or what. I just said wait now yet, before Mark backing up to his cruiser, where we waited for what must have been half an hour for the creature to flee the vehicle. It just stared at us with those creepy eyes and continued making clicking noises that were so loud that I could not hear my radio. Finally, Mark said he had enough and shot in the air twice. This startled the creature, which had then prompted it to make a wailing sound like you would hear from an owl, but very high-pitched. The creature came out, then it shot quickly over to the parking lot. It did this extremely fast. Mark fired another 3 shots, but it was gone. Mark and I looked at each other and said, what the hell? We made a report on what happened, but we did not detail the future. Instead said someone locked a bobcat in their car. I still work as a ranger today. Every time I stop a car at night, I'm always asking for backup. I was working in a well-known Civil War fort on the coast of Maine. I worked in the office as the assistant to the executive director for the nonprofit that ran the place. But on weekends and days volunteers didn't show up. I will cover gift shop duty. This particular weekend, it was at the tail end of October, near the end of open season, but also the weekend of one of our biggest fundraisers, turning the forts into a giant haunted house. No one was really around, since it was a cold day and raining cats and dogs. It was just myself and the main torpedo shed building and the attendant at the gate. The rest of the place was completely deserted. The director had been in and out all day repairing Halloween set pieces that had fallen down or putting new things up, fiddling with lighting, etc. By this time, however, he had gone home to rest before the event started up again that night. I was alone in the gift shop, reading and generally resting up from haunting the place for 5 hours in the cold granite forts the night before. I don't remember what time this dude came in, but it was sometime in the early afternoon. I greeted him as he entered the shop, then went back to 14 shirts or whatever I was doing at the time. I don't remember him greeting me back. He kind of looked around the shop for a moment, and then towards the candy rack, which is directly across the way from the register, perpendicular to me. About 5 minutes passed, and I realize this guy is standing in front of the candy rack. He's absolutely still not moving at all. He's not reaching for any candy. His head's not moving to look at any displays. He's just absolutely still. I don't lift my head because I don't want him to know that I'm checking on him. So I lift my gaze and still glance at him through my hair. I have long bangs. A chill of dread runs through me at the realization that he is standing facing the rack, but he is also staring at me from the corner of his eye. He had been doing this for the past 5 minutes. His eyes are intense. I just don't have any other way to describe it. I absolutely knew he meant to hurt me if given the chance. I don't freeze, but my insides have gone cold. I am all alone in this building with this guy. There is absolutely no one around. And if something happened, no one is going to hear it or come to help me. There are walkie-talkies to contact the park rangers, but they're out in the forge for the haunting volunteers to use in case of an emergency, such as one of the reenactors falling 8 feet off the ledge in the dark and cracking a skull on the cobblestones, as happened one year. I finished voting the shirts and I'm considering my options, trying to look blasé, but secretly freaking the hell out. Imagine to my relief when one of the volunteers, my boss, walked in. I'm saved. They walked around the lobby, picking up stuff and getting ready to go out and ready the displays. Meanwhile, the dude at the candy rack has still not moved a muscle and is still staring at me. It's been over 10 minutes by now, and I'm seriously unnerved. I tried to catch the volunteer, my boss's attention to get them to come into the gift shop and help me out here. But they're too intent on what they're doing. After a moment, they leave me alone again. This is it. I'm frickin' doomed. This guy is going to vault over the counter at any moment and assault me, I think to myself in my early 20s, and was a lot more timid than I am now. So I'm at a loss of what to do. I'm trying to be polite for God knows what reason. Also, I'm 5'10" and weigh 130 pounds soaking wet. The only defense I might have is my fury. But I know that easily be overpowered. I have visions of people returning to the building and finding my lifeless body behind the counter, or not finding me at all. I want with everything in me to get out of there. But the only doors within hand's reach of him. The gift shop is small. If I pass him, it gives him the perfect opportunity to grab me without even having to reach, but unable to stay in this guy's gaze anymore, not caring if he steals the whole goddamn shop out from under me. I quickly skip around and go around the corner and rush past him. I hightail it to the office and shutting off the door. I stand there for a moment listening, heart pounding in my chest. There are big windows in the office. And as I grabbed my person's cell phone, I am sure I'm going to look up any minute to see him standing out on the walk staring at me, or hear him trying to get the door open. I quickly text my sister and tell her that some dude is creeping me the heck out in the call the gate and have them send the rangers to come down. I was afraid to speak it out loud for fear that this might guide this guy into his action. I didn't want him to know that I knew he was watching me. Feeling obligated to return, I pocket my phone, head back to the gift shop praying that someone else would be there. In the meantime, the student's still there. He's looking at the candy. But I know as soon as I get back behind the counter, he will once again be staring at me. I can't do it. I quickly turn and hide again in the office, terrified after what seemed like an interminable bad time. I hear the lobby door open in the voice of my sister. She has shown up with not only herself, but several of our friends that happen to be hanging out at her house and our big protective German shepherd. The dude was finally gone. I was so relieved to see them on, and I was just so freaked out. I was just hoping that the guy would not come back. When the Rangers came down, I gave the description of the dude, but they couldn't seem to find him in the park. My sister and our friend stay with me for the rest of my shift, which wasn't long before my boss returned. We immediately dressed him down for not noticing my obvious distress and leaving me alone with a crib. I never did see that guy again. For I don't ever want to be in a similar situation. I've become more confident since then, and I'm sure I would have hired the dude if that would have happened again. Still, I hope it never dies. I work as a caregiver in a memory care facility. When I first started working there and getting to know the residents, there was one in particular that I wanted to know more about. His name was Melbourne, and Melbourne has never been married, has no children, no pictures of any family or friends in his room. And in all my time working there only has ever had one friend come to visit him. The one thing I really knew about him is that he had been a Forest Service ranger and one of our local national forests. Obviously, sending this into you means I listen to your channel and others for true creepy stories, especially ones centered around search and rescue national parks, etc. These intrigued me the most because nature is definitely creepy. So one night, I started asking questions if he had ever seen anything unexplained in his time as a forest ranger. Being as he is in memory care, I really wasn't able to get much out of him. But yes or no questions. I realized I wasn't getting anywhere. But just out of curiosity, I asked him if he had a special someone in his life. The conversation that follows still makes me shiver. Melvin replied to my question with a symbol. Yes, I was engaged once. I asked him what had happened to his fiancée, and he turned his head away to look at the ceiling and then said, I was a forest ranger. I knew exactly where to bury her where no one will ever find her. That was the last question about his life I ever asked him. I never got another word out of him. But he would call me a bitch or a dirty pig sometimes, but that's about it. The way he said it, it was like he was remembering his past. I don't know how to explain this, unless you have experienced it before. But memory care patients, especially those with dementia or Alzheimer's, sometimes have these moments of clarity where you just know that they are lucid. This was one of those moments. And I just know he was being honest. And to this day, it's definitely really creepy. I have an uncle that used to work as a park ranger somewhere in Michigan. He's gone through nights of tigers losing campsites without a working flashlight, drunk guys drowning in rapids, and kids found dead from hypothermia cradle peacefully at the base of tall pines. But he never seemed disturbed when telling the stories he saw is just part of the job, which I guess I'll never really understand. He took me and my middle brother on a walk through my grandparents' woods one evening, while all the adults made dinner. The other two boys were completely occupied with a video game that was only to player. And so our uncle decided that he would give us other to some special attention. Especially to me, as being the only girl, I would get excluded from a lot. We walked for maybe 15 minutes before my uncle stopped dead at the swamp area in the woods, a place that we went to often to hunt for mushrooms in the summer. But right in the middle of the soggy forest fluke was a 10-foot spiral staircase. And none of us could remember ever been there before. It was like someone had built a house and everything, but the stairs had been swallowed up by the swamp. At the top was a very small landing where a welcome mat or carpet sat. It was completely clean, untouched from what we could tell. I looked up at my uncle, and the look in his face struck me like a cold ice pick. He was terrified, shaking like it was winter. He seemed to be transfixed on what he was looking at. His eyes were darting around the tree. It was like he was looking for something. He grabbed her hands and walked fast. I have always been very short and unable to keep up and found myself being carried all the way back to the house. He sat me down only when we were in direct sight of the house and told us not to say anything about it to anyone, especially the boys, and not to go out of sight of the house without him. We were very confused and scared. It just sounded insane. We kept our mouths shut. I recently went back to visit and convinced my brother to come with me to see the staircase, though. It took a lot of convincing for him to come along, and he refused to go without our gun and our 200-pound mastiff. When we got there to the right spots, there was nothing. It was just a clearing, no bits of metal, no carpet, just an empty clearing and a nice big patch of mushrooms. Very creepy to me. Honestly, those mushrooms might have been in our dinner. If our mastiff having growled the moment we stepped towards them, who's probably at a deer, but we will have quickly never been back since or told anyone when we saw the energy around that little swamp area is so weird. Has anybody else ever walked into the woods and saw these random staircases? I see a lot of forest rangers bring them up, and my uncle being one has definitely creepy that we saw one with him.